Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to Page Chewing with my wonderful and talented co-host Taylor from Made Between the Pages. And today we have a very special guest, um, someone who many people in fantasy circles would consider iconic in terms of writing fantasy, and that is none other than Tad Williams. Tad, thank you so much for joining us. We're so honored to have you on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I always wonder, by the way, at what point in a writer's career do people start saying nice things like iconic and special instead of just old, you know? So I,
Not sure where the line is, but you're definitely
no, and
there.
iconic is definitely better. It's definitely a better adjective. So yeah,
Yeah, I think we'll stick with iconic, and that's no lie.
yeah.
And where we'd like to start this conversation is that again, you are considered iconic, and one of the reasons you're considered iconic is because so many writers who they themselves are considered iconic and signal in the field, they speak about being inspired and influenced by you and your writing. So writers such as Brandon Sanderson, George R. R. Martin, John Gwynne, they all talk about Tad Williams as someone who has inspired them. So where we'd like to start the conversation is, so Tad Williams coming up as a writer, coming up as a reader. Who inspired you? Who are the authors that made you want to write fantasy and created a love for you, love of fantasy in you?
Well, it was actually a love-hate relationship. Not hate's too strong a word, but obviously there were people who influenced me. The first ones being a lot of the kids' books that were read to me when I was young, which tended toward being English and kind of E. Nesbit and Wind in the Willows and the Winnie the Pooh books and all that my mom read to me when I was young. When I was about 11, she gave me The Lord of the Rings, and that was a major thing, along with Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. Those were both books that really gripped me in very different ways, but still both really gripped me. I'll mention some other writers who were influential in a second, but what really pushed me toward fantasy was as I was starting to think about writing, which is a whole complicated thing in and of itself, what moved me toward writing. But as I was beginning to think of it, I thought, first off, well, at least I'll be able to judge if I write a fantasy novel. I think I'll be able to judge what's decent and, if I've succeeded or not, just because I had read a lot of fantasy. But then the other thing was also in the 70s and early 80s, when I was thinking about this stuff, there were a lot of what I will call not Tolkienian imitators, but people who were so influenced by Tolkien and by The Lord of the Rings that they didn't sort of differentiate between Tolkien as canon and Tolkien as an individual creator. So they took a lot of things that Tolkien picked because he wanted them in his stories, such as certain types of European mythology, what his version of elves were like, or his version of dwarves, or that kind of stuff. And then a lot of the writers that followed him in the early days of my kind of starting to think about the field very much just kind of went, oh, that's canon. That's how it has to be. And I realized quite early on that, I'm two generations after Tolkien. I'm quite a different person. He was a lovely man from what I know of him, but he was raised in South Africa. He lived in Oxford. He was very opposed to change. He was very small c conservative, in the sense of not, I don't think so much politically, but, in the sense that he didn't like motor cars in Oxford. He didn't like streetlights. That changed something that was important to him from his childhood. So, and also, oh yeah, and he was like a cradle Catholic as well, so very religious. And I'm none of these things. I come from a family with no religious thing whatsoever, very open-minded about like, hey, whatever you want to do in life and believe in life is fine. And as a result, there were a lot of differences, philosophical differences between my worldview and Tolkien's, that I felt that other writers that were kind of coming along in the 70s completely missed. They didn't think about how Tolkien was making personal choices. They were seeing it like, this is how it has to be. This is the world of high fantasy. So I felt like I want to talk about Tolkien and contemporary fantasy, but I don't believe in just writing an article. I want to make a story to show what I'm thinking. And that not didn't Tail Chaser Song was my first book, the cat fantasy, but that it was more in the Dragon Bone Chair and those books was where I really went, okay, what is it that I actually want to put in my books? What will make them mine particularly? So at the same time as I was beginning to have these thoughts, I was reading a lot of writers who are kind of back and forth over genre boundaries, like Michael Moorcock, Fritz Leiber, Ursula Le Guin, Theodore Sturgeon, Harlan Ellison, the aforementioned Bradbury, whose science fiction was never very sciency, you know. So I was really inspired by these writers who kind of just had the idea and wrote it and worried and did not have to worry or didn't bother to because it was pointless how it was going to be sold. So unfortunately for me, I've always written these really long books. So my meandering trip back and forth between genres takes decades, and it's hard for people to see that I'm writing different kinds of things. But that was basically it. I wanted to take the wonder and the joy that I got from my early reading experiences and the world building wonder of something like The Lord of the Rings, and then make it my own, which is, I think, probably the best formula for anybody wanting to write in a genre, is find what you love in the genre, but then find a way to make it personal.
Yes, and I've heard a lot of people discuss your books in tandem with Tolkien or in conversation with Tolkien. So, hearing you say that he was, a formative influence in almost what not to do is very interesting to me. So I'm kind of curious if, as an author, you wrote the story with an intention, with, a purposeful thought in your mind. But once you put it out into the world, it becomes a shared product. And I have heard some people discuss some books, not just yours, but as like copycats of Tolkien. So I'm wondering for you, if someone doesn't exactly understand that kind of subversive aspect of your books, how you deal with that as an author of your caliber, of your size.
Well, I don't deal with it, to be quite honest with you. And that's why I was saying, that I'm kind of have this old fashioned belief of like, if you want to give a lecture, then hire a hall. If you want to tell a story, tell a story. You can do whatever you want to within the bounds of genre, as long as you fulfill the genre promises. And I've said this before, this is not, the first time I've ever offered this thought, but basically genre fiction, it's one of the reasons it's really stupid for people to compare genre to literary fiction. Literary fiction is not a genre. Literary fiction is just what everybody agrees is, a certain kind of mainstream fiction. It's mainstream fiction with ambition. Genres always have both things contained in them. They have the low end, which is just trying to sell books to people who love dragons or mysteries or romance or whatever. That's, the commercial end of the genre. But at the upper end of all these things, even romance, if you think about, the really good writers who are sort of on the edge of that, at the upper end, all of these things are literature, in all genres, and certainly in our genre, certainly in fantasy and science fiction, there is genuine literature. So I don't worry about what people are going to think, because I realized early on when I wrote the Dragonbone Chair, I got a lot of reviewers saying, oh, it's another pseudo Tolkien. I went, you just missed the entire point, didn't you? That just slid right by you, that whole thing where I'm commenting on Tolkien and talking about the effect he had on my generation of writers. And I realized at that point, you can either spend all of your time trying to convince people that they're wrong about something that's important to you, or you can just say, you may never convince everybody, but I know this is what I wanted to do and I will keep doing it. So when people tend to lump me into the Tolkienian imitators or whatever, that's okay. That's their shorthand. I don't agree, but you have to know something about Tolkien even to get into that conversation. So at least they're somewhere in my area of the world, and if they really want to know, we can meet at a convention or something and I can explain why I don't agree with them. But by and large, the older I get and the longer I write, the more I realize you cannot control what happens once the artistic product, to use a horrible word, leaves your hands. You cannot cover it with author's notes explaining how something should be read or arguing with the critics of your previous, it's just stupid. That's not what art is anyway. Art has to stand on its own. I was thinking that I was at my wife and I happen to like art and modern art and things like that. And I was at a exhibition of things where everything had to be explained. It was a very modern video installation thing. And it was okay. There was nothing inherently wrong with it, but they were explaining everything. And I'm going, couldn't I just walk in and see it? And then maybe you could have your explanations in another room. So I had a chance to react to it as art before you're going to tell me what I should be feeling. And that's very much how I feel with my books as well. And if people want to read them on the pure level of, an adventure story with magic, that's good. That's how I started when I was a kid. I just wanted to read things that I thought were exciting. And if people want to look to see if there's greater depth in them, I think there is, but they have to decide for themselves based on where they are, who they are, what they're looking for, So I would say that's one of the few things I've learned as I've gotten older, is, conflict doesn't really resolve much unless you're literally fighting for your life or your principles, but the rest of the time, conflict is just noise, and in the largest sense of the white noise, it's just noise. So I try to just put everything in the work now and let people decide what they want to decide. That was the end of that very long answer, by the way.
No, people are here to listen to you, not us. I love that.
I'm not sure
And I
about
know
that, but anyway.
I know PL really probably resonated with that because I know your main character as well, PL, is used for commentary, not only commentary, but often. And some people don't quite get the commentary, I've heard. So
That's exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the amazing things about the internet. Okay. Is that you have this instantaneous ability to communicate with people literally all over the world. And if you speak English, you have the added advantage that that's, become the amusingly named lingua franca of the modern world in most ways. So you have this huge outreach possible. The fact is, though, is that most of what we talk about is still over the back fence gossip of some kind or another. It's mostly, ooh, did you hear what so-and-so did? Or can you believe that he wore that? Or, and that's carried over into politics. It's carried over into every field of endeavor that is represented through the internet because it's so flippin' easy to not just comment, but to find an audience. And because the potential audience is so much broader these days, you can also find a significant percentage of people who will believe anything or agree with anything, no matter how crazy, right? I mean, I could stand here right now and say the intelligent bathtub people of Cygnus 4 are taking over later this afternoon. And most of you would just do what you guys are doing, which is kind of like smile and laugh. There would be a few people out there within range of this podcast that would go, oh my God, that's what I was always worried about. The bathtub people are coming, and they would then pass it along to other people who would find confirmation for their own biases. And before you know it, bathtub people is trending across social media, So how can you, in a situation like that, how can you base anything on the fact that a lot of like-minded people agreed with you? You can't. I mean, you can find like-minded people who believe in child molestation. You can find like-minded people who believe in, dropping nuclear bombs and taking civilization back to step zero or what. I mean, you can find any crazy thing that people will agree with. I used to live in Berkeley. I saw this before the internet. You could put any weird fetish poster up on a wall in Berkeley and people would be signing up for whatever it was, So, and that was 50 years ago. So that's my basic thing is just you can waste so much energy trying to control conversations or trying to respond or trying to set the record straight. And maybe when I was younger, I would have been trying harder to do it. But I'm a mature person now. Uh, Again, that's code for old, and I don't want to spend the last however many decades of my life having arguments with people over things. I'd rather write more books, you know, and that definitely goes to whatever critical establishment now reads my work. I don't even read reviews anymore, not because I think they're all wrong. A lot of them are lovely and glowing and people who clearly, from my point of view, get what I'm trying to do. So it's not that, oh, they don't get me, I'm going to take my ball and go home. It's more just like, so if they don't like me, I'll be furious and want to argue with them. And if they do like me, I will just feel like, okay, good, they got it. But there's nothing of purpose for me in that sense of getting too involved. Occasionally my wife says, you really have to read this review. This person's really spot on, or makes a new point, but by and large, yeah, it's just, I can't get too worked up, because this is the other bad news I have for you guys, since you're probably both younger than me, is at a certain point, you just don't have as much energy as you used to. And you start thinking actively about conserving that energy. And I mean, it starts when you're like 30, but by the time you're my age, it's like a major internal conversation in your head. How much time have I got? And how much of it do I want to waste on this kind of crap? And that happens every day, not just with books or anything. That's like they get your order wrong from DoorDash or something, and you're going,
Yeah.
do I really want to go to the mat over, like not getting enough pot stickers? I mean, like
Yeah,
call them
right.
back and get them to change my credit card detail, and no, the hell with it. So anyway, I don't know how I got to pot stickers, but that tends to happen to me.
Well, you nailed the age that it starts, because I currently am 30 myself, and I have noticed a shift in my view of what is worth my time and what is not. But something else people often say also, when they talk about your work, is most people mention the slow pacing of mostly the larger epic fantasy. And
Yeah.
if you can't tell on my shelves behind me, I am a fan of slow paced, larger epic fantasy. So it's all a matter of taste, whether it works for people or not. But I'm wondering,
Absolutely.
as an author, what are the benefits that you see, or the positives that you see, to a slow paced story? Is it something you do on purpose, or is it something that just is your writing style and comes out
It,
that way?
it's a little of both, in that as far as it being now something that's fairly established, my readers, or a lot of my readers, do want these long, complicated, in-depth volumes. So there's a kind of a pressure to do that. That's definitely there. But it started originally in much the same way that my love for Tolkien in general started. And one of the things I loved about The Lord of the Rings is you could tell at the beginning of the book that Tolkien himself was not sure where things were going. There's a lot of elements that aren't completely crystallized in the first parts of the books. But the positive element of that, and what I took to heart, was you feel very invested in the world, because you've had time. In Tolkien's case, you've spent time in the Shire, you've been to a big party, you've seen, you know, Frodo selling off Bag End and all this kind of stuff, met Sam, met the gaffer, all this stuff that makes you feel like, all right, I know the Shire. And because the hobbits are the focal point characters through much of the books, and their love of their home and their fear for it being changed in a permanent negative way is very, very much a part of their who they are as characters, and how we as readers put ourselves into the story, because we all have those kinds of feelings of what's important to us. So when I was starting the Dragonbone Chair, and what I wanted to do, I had one of my goals with the Dragonbone Chair was to enact the journey, not so much a hero's journey as just the human journey of starting with the familiar and what you've been raised with, and the expectations you have of what is real and what is true and what is important. And how, as you move out into the world, whether in a geographical sense, as Simon, the character, does, or in a a life experience sense, as most of us do, whether we move anywhere or not. We get older, we get more experience. I wanted the reader to feel invested in the familiar of what was Simon's belief about how the world was, which was kind of quasi-medieval, fairly settled, and had been decades under the same ruler, et cetera, so that as you get out into the world, that first of all, the things that change and that he learns are more surprising to you because you've been well established in what is the norm, but also because there are a lot of parallels in all of our journeys in life where we have to go out in the world to find out which of the things from our youth or childhood or whatever that we want to hang on to, and which things don't bear up against the experiences that we have out of, whether, when we go to college, we go to work, we go to, we get married, or we find a partner and start a family, whatever it might be, we begin to change. So I wanted that. So I wanted all of this stuff to seem like, okay, we really know the starting point for this world, because then it's going to start to change, not just for the character, but then later on, the entire world falls apart. And I wanted readers to feel that. And I knew even at the time that, this was not the norm. Tolkien got criticized for, people go like, oh, nothing happens till they get to Bree. It's not even worth reading, and people were there before the internet. People were having these conversations, So I knew that there was going to be a little bit of pushback on that, but I also knew that that's what I wanted. I wanted a slow burn beginning that would invest people in the characters and the world and the worldview. I hope that made sense.
It definitely did. Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, is that slow buildup, that base is so key for understanding the contrast for later in the story. If we take off running, which, depending on the genre can definitely work, but for larger fantasy, when you have, those stakes, the world ending stakes, you need to understand what is ending. So I think that's a really, really good point that you made.
Well, yeah, because these big books tend to be about catastrophic circumstances. There are some that aren't, but I can't think of very many of these multi-volume things that are not. I'm thinking of Gene Wolfe, or what George just did, or, what George is still trying to finish, or, any number of other things. But, they're all about these apocalyptic periods in the history of whatever culture it is, or cultures. So, yeah, I mean, if you don't know it, you're just dropped into the middle of it. It's like somebody suddenly takes you to another country and drops you into the middle of a sports stadium and says, all right, we're going to watch this great match. You're going, I don't even know what they're doing out there. Is that a ball? Is that a puck? Is that is that a live hamster they're batting around? I mean, you just don't know. So it helps to invest people. Sorry, I just started off again. There we go. But that's it. Yeah.
No need to apologize at all. And then something else that you mentioned in the beginning of this interview that I found absolutely fascinating when just looking at the larger scope of your works is how many genres you've written. So I think, you're the Dragonbone Chair and Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is the main thing that people think of. But I didn't even know that you had written a middle grade. And you've written, like you mentioned earlier in this interview as well, a cat fantasy was your first fantasy. There's also, I believe you call it fantasy, but there's a very sci-fi, the Otherworld series as well.
Otherland is definitely an epic fantasy, but with very serious sci-fi trappings. I mean, it's meant to be read as sci-fi. It's more sciencey than, say, Bradbury. It's more like Theodore Sturgeon sciencey. So yeah, that definitely I consider it a science fiction. It just has the form of an epic fantasy.
Okay, so it's genre bending left and right, all over the place. So as someone who's written so broadly, I'm curious, what inspires you? Like, now is the time to switch the genre, or now I feel like writing this, because it's fascinating to me.
Part of it is that by the time I finish one of these multi-volume things, I've usually been 5, 6, 7 years on the damn thing. And I'm just like, oh my God, I have to write something different. If I have to do any more medieval dialogue, or try to figure out what kind of plumbing people had in, the marsh villages of the 1200s Iraqi marsh Arabs, or I mean, it's just like at a certain point, can I do something industrial? That was one of the reasons I loved writing the Bobby Dollar books, because they are set, even though it's an alternate version of the San Francisco Bay Area, it's set right now, and that's where I grew up. And as a result, the characters, especially the main character, because he's the narrator, could speak in modern dialect, and could make the kind of jokes that I would make, and I did not have to purposefully retranslate everything back and forth into some, different kind of dialect or different kind of era of speech. So yeah, sometimes it's just like, thank God I get to change something. But also, as I mentioned, if I had lived in a different era, and if I had not been so strongly influenced by Tolkien, I probably would have written shorter and had been even more back and forth. But as I said, I made the tragic mistake of writing these really long volumes. So it's like turning an ocean liner. It just does not happen quickly. You've got to finish once you've started one of these things, and we all know what happens when you don't finish in the era of the internet. You just get completely talked for years for not having finished. So I have to finish these things, and as a result, I don't get to jump very often between boundaries. But I loved all different kinds. I mean, that's the main thing. I grew up on not just fantasy, not just science fiction, but all kinds of writing. And my favorite writers, if I listed them, yes, some of them are fantasy and science fiction writers, but a lot of them aren't. So, I never wanted to feel like I can only write this one kind of thing. And I won't go into it because it's a long, complicated subject, but that's, I think, been the main, not friction, but the kind of main stress point of my career as an adult writer, the last 20 years, 30 years or so, is the push between what's expected of you, what the publishers know will sell, and what your own personal desire is to write. Because I would have written all kinds of crazy crap that I would have loved. I had a horror novel I started. I had all kinds of other things I've started or thought about. I have 4 or 5 in my head right now. But you also have to, at a certain point, you got kids, you got a mortgage, you know what the publishers want from you, which is something that is easy to sell, that they can just say, oh, it's another Tad Williams fantasy, blah, blah, or whatever, whoever they're talking about. So there's a pressure from that end to like, don't do something weird. You're going to scare your audience off, and we don't know how to sell it. So yeah, it's always there. But if I had had my way, if I had best of all possible worlds, I would be hopping back and forth over the line. I'd be writing mysteries. I'd be writing pure comedies. I'd be doing all kinds of things because those are all things I like to read. I just froze PL completely. Oh, there he is. He's back.
So there he is.
I was going like, oh my God, what did I say? I just froze him entirely.
And then something actually that PL just brought up from Layla. She had a comment here that said, I also, the next one below that one, maybe PL was the one that caught my attention. It says, I also liked the characterization of the Sithi as having reasons for their perspective instead of just being an other. This really stuck out to me because I've seen when people talk about your works, a lot of what they talk about is how you deal with characters and even history itself as an unreliable narrator. And you really engage with those themes and those ideas. And as someone who mentioned that they were, you were in conversation with Tolkien in a more subversive way, I'm wondering if this kind of had the same feel to it, if you were trying to call to attention the fact that, the histories that maybe a lot of fantasy was based on at that time could be unreliable.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Taylor. Now, one of the things that I wanted very strongly, as I said, I'm a completely different generation, completely different upbringing. And one of the things that I felt had been blindly taken from Tolkien, although it certainly predates Tolkien, was the whole concept of the golden age. And in Tolkien, I think it in part goes straight back to his faith and being Catholic and believing in humanity as a fallen We are a fallen race. We have fallen from perfection, which we had in the Garden of Eden. And then, we did all those things we shouldn't do. And, but Tolkien's idea of a golden age may have been religiously based, but it exists in other literary formats, and it was completely accepted as canon by all of the writers that followed in Tolkien's immediate wake. And I remember, for instance, reading the first time I read, I've just gone blank on the name of it, Stephen Donaldson's first trilogy, the one about
the
first,
Thomas Chronicles of Thomas Covenant.
Lord Fowl's Bane.
Lord Fowl's Bane. Oh, the first book.
Yeah. First book. And I remember reading
all of us struggled so hard with that. Did we all just lose our card, our fantasy card?
It's been a while. But there's a lot of positives to say about those books as well. So don't get me wrong. This is not me dismissing them, but I do remember a certain frustration. This is before I'd written anything myself, when I was reading them. And there were two things. First of all, was how the bad guy showed up and announced that he was the bad guy at the very beginning. And it was almost like he walked out on stage and said, I am more evil than you can even imagine. I am going to do such evil things. And my first response to that was, evil people very seldom think they're evil. They almost always think that they're the only ones who've got it right. And yes, a few weaklings will have to be smushed like bugs for me to put my divine order in place, but that's okay, because I have the true, best of humanity in my mind. And the other thing was that in the Thomas Covenant books, as far as I could tell, it had been like 500 years or more, nothing had happened before Lord Fowl returned. So it was as though they started in, like 1350 France, and now it was 1850 France, but they were living exactly the same. Nothing had changed. And in part because I'm a history buff freak, whatever you want to call it. I love history, but also because just, my sense of things is that, God, no, you're totally downplaying ordinary people. Ordinary people are the ones that are living those lives, doing those things, finding new things. Some of them are extraordinary, ordinary people, and they invent things, but everybody is changing the environment around them. That's why we don't live on the savannah anymore. That we've done thousands of things as human beings that have lifted us into a different kind of state of life. So yeah, no, absolutely. I felt very strongly about that. And I felt very strongly about the golden age in Tolkien. And again, not that Tolkien had it or that it was important to Tolkien, but that so many other writers just seemed to adopt it, like, oh, everything was great once. And then the evil Lord came and he eviled it all up. And when he was done, it had been thoroughly evilated, and I'm like, really? Is that all that happened, in all that time? And why was everything so great before? What about, were there no slaves? Were they not having to eat bugs ever during a famine? Or, just normal questions you would have if you were talking about an actual group of living people on Earth. So yes, Taylor, to answer your question in a very long and roundabout way, that's exactly what I was dealing with, was that kind of unconscious acceptance of, because Tolkien was so good and so formative, of everything he put in as being, this is how it is in epic fantasy. All elves must be tall and standoffish and beautiful. All dwarves must be small and dour and like mining and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that was very much something I wanted to attack head on, at least in my roundabout way.
Well, that's fantastic answer. I'm processing that now, like P.L. was processing the last one.
I talk a lot. I apologize, and
no.
There are things to unpack because I talk like I write, and I write like I talk. So there's always 17 ideas trying to force their way into whatever I'm saying, and I'm multitasking at the best of times. So.
Oh, I meant that in the best way possible. But I wanted to agree with that comment that P.L. just put up. I don't know if you've heard of the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, but everything you're saying, He says, I think was really.
I know Ken Liu, but I don't know the Dandelion Dynasty. So I appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be right up the same themes that you're discussing.
Sounds good.
And I promise, PL, I will let you get a question in just a second. But I have one more that just came from what you said right there, Tad, which was you write like you talk. And a lot of people, when they discuss your writing, discuss your prose. And I know PL loves prose. So if he loves an author in the way that he loves you, I know the prose is on point. So I'm curious, when you get into writing mode, is there like an environment that helps you get that beautiful prose out? Do you sit down, do you have a coffee, do you listen to heavy metal in the background? Like, what do you do to help develop this prose that you're known for?
Well, part of it is I actually talk this way. I try not to when I'm doing interviews, but you could ask my wife. I'm always like lapsing off into these weird little codas, to my statements, and 3 or 4 jumps off of where the conversation started. And she's gotten very good at just like going back to whatever she was doing, because she knows I'll run out of steam eventually. But so a lot of it is just, that's how I am. I'm somebody who grew up on words. I love words. I love language. I love communicating and ideas. Both Deborah and I are very big on that whole idea that it's ideas that matter, not things. And one of the things, though, that I find is that I have changed as a writer over the years, in that I am kind of a little less heavy prosy than I used to be. And that's mostly just because my tastes have changed a little bit. So when I was younger, I was more influenced by people like Bradbury and by Tom Robbins, I believe. Yeah, Tom Robbins, the guy who wrote Another Roadside Attraction and Still Life with Woodpecker and all that stuff. And it's very artsy, florid, very complicated similes and things like that, and very funny. And I had a lot of favorite writing like that. John Barth is another one. But as I've gotten older, I have been more possessed by the idea of those kinds of things stick out better when they're in a slightly simpler setting. So I have become a little more spare in my prose. I'm thinking about this because I'm editing at the moment. So it's very much in my mind that as I go through things, if I see two similes or 2 metaphors in the same 2 sentences next to each other, I will oftentimes go, I think I'm going to take out the weaker of the 2 of those, just because, I'm kind of over egging the pudding, as it were. So, but yeah, no, I mean, most of what happens with me in my prose is that I'm just trying to describe what I'm seeing. And I'm fortunate enough to have a fairly good vocabulary. And then when I go back through it, I start saying, yeah, but now what does it feel like to the person reading it? They may not have the same associations that I do. They may not have my endless patience with blather. They may not have read any James Joyce, so they may not want any Joycean paragraphs in the middle of their fantasy novel. So then I will kind of tamp it down a little bit. But I love language, and that's the bottom line. I love language. I love a well-turned phrase. For instance, mentioning somebody who's like hugely important to me as a writer, P.G. Wodehouse, is like, well, one of the if not the greatest, one of the great comic writers in the history of the English language. And the reason why is because he was a prose master. And you go and read his stuff. I see PL nodding. If you go and read his stuff, that these little bon mots that are just dropped, and they're mostly all offhand, they're throwaways. They're seen from Bertie Wooster's perspective, and he's telling you everything about what a lovable idiot he is without realizing it, and the jokes, they're full of jokes, and they're tremendously funny, and they're all like Dickens. They're very much about defeating your expectation at the last moment. Instead of saying something was gigantic, you would say it was not of such a size as to cause public report, or something like that. You will go all the way around the point to avoid slamming someone in the head with it. So those are the kind of things that affected me when I was very young. When my mom would read to me, I think she was the one who first introduced P.G. Wodehouse to me. And a lot of people like that are really there for me. And some of them are in science fiction. You know, Harlan Ellison used to be that way, Sturgeon, Ursula Le Guin. But it's something I like in any format. And it's very much something that I try to bring to my work. And in that sense, if people like my prose, they're probably much like me. And I'm sorry for them. But, you know,
Guilty.
yeah, you know, I mean, but that's one last point on this subject. You know, this is oftentimes I would get people asking me, more so when I used to leave the house. People would come up to me at conventions and stuff and say, you know, what is it that I need to do to write a book? What are they buying these days? You know, do you think I should write this kind of book or this kind, you know? And I would say to them, honest to God, what you need to do is write a book that you would enjoy reading, because you're a much better judge of what a good book is than trying to imagine what somebody else would think a good book was. So write the book you want to read that makes you laugh or cry or be excited, and then just hope there's other people like you out there, and that's your audience. And I feel that very strongly, you know, that I speak to people who like words. I speak to people who have a childlike love of these kinds of stories, but have an adult sensibility and hold them to that standard. You know, that just because they're books that are kind of like the ones we liked when we were kids doesn't mean you can get away with writing books for 7-year-olds and sell them to adults. These are adults who used to be 7-year-olds, and you try to find that in yourself and recapitulate that on paper.
Well, I must say, I truly enjoyed your prose, Tad, in the 2 books that I've read from you so far. So just to put that out there, so fantastic. I have yeah, I have many questions, but I'd love to give our wonderful readers and participants in the chat a chance to. There's a couple in the chat that I'd like to get to. The first one is from the awesome Eddie Castro, and he's a great person, fan of the channel, friend. So Eddie asks, "What inspired the War of the Flowers, and will it ever get a narrated version?"
Well, thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that. Narrated version, like I assume that Eddie, that you mean like a book on, you know, whatever that
Audiobook. I think he believes in audiobook.
Yeah. Speaking of my command of words, I thought it was already. I thought we had that one, but I might be wrong. I would love to see more have happen with War of the Flowers. It was inspired actually by 2 things. One was the fact that when I was very young, or not very young, when I was a teenager, early young teenager, my mom finally admitted to me that my stepdad was not my biological father, which I already knew. So it was no big deal to me. But it was clearly a big deal to her. So I kind of, when I figured that out at a slightly later age, that it was a big deal for her to talk to me about this. And that she had basically been pregnant and left by her then boyfriend of the time. She was in college, had to drop out, you know. So at the time, it didn't mean much to me. I think I went over to one of my good friend's house, and he opened the door and I went, "Hey, guess what? I'm a bastard." And he said, "Cool." And then the next thing he said was probably, "Let's get high." But the fact was, it had a much bigger effect on me later when I thought about what it meant to her to tell me this. So that was part of it. This whole idea of not just bastardy, but having a mysterious father, and or a mysterious parent, but it's oftentimes fathers for male characters, and what a big deal that is in myth and folklore, and how important paternity used to be in ancient societies. So that was part of it. And then I had a dream one night where I was shortly after I'd moved to England, I think. And I was on a railroad siding, you know, platform, and all the people around me were men wearing Victorian outfits, you know, bowler hats and suits and umbrellas, but they all had wings. And that's one of the few dreams that I've ever had that has been the kind of kicking off point for a whole book. I've had other dreams which have showed up in my books, but I don't dream much for some reason, or at least I don't remember them very well. So it was those 2 things. And then, as usually happens with me, and Eddie, I apologize for going off War of the Flowers a little bit, but this will also touch on some other things. What happens with me is that these become like little, like the way that the first agglomerations of gas in a young universe begin to cling together and spin and become something, and then they have a gravity and it attracts other things. Story ideas are much like that for me too, and just those two things, the idea of paternity and the mysterious lost parent and this kind of weird cityscape of modern looking people but with wings, and those two things were the first things that stuck together, but then other things began to attach themselves. So I began thinking about how lucky I had been to get out of a certain phase in my life where I didn't know what I was going to do, and what would I have been like if that hadn't happened, and if I hadn't sold the book, and if I was still scuffling at age 30 or 32 or something. And so that became sort of the basis for the main character. And then very quickly at that point, things begin to agglomerate. You start actively saying, okay, well, if I want this kind of a world, how do I make that? How do I get that? What will make that happen? And as soon as I came across the idea of magic versus sort of electricity, and industrial versus magical, and like, how would that change the society? Then it was off and running. And then it was just a question of what story I wanted to tell, because the world was sort of building itself in the back of my mind. This part, in case you were wondering.
Wow, that's incredible. It's just fascinating. I found that answer so fascinating. It's just a coincidence, I guess, that illegitimacy, parentage, lineage, those are things that I explore a lot in my own writing, and
Yeah.
I've always found that whole thread just fascinating. So just wow, that's amazing. So
Well, see, that PL, that is perfect proof of what I said, which is that you write the thing that you care about, and you just hope, and you hope you do it well enough that the other people who are like you will go, oh, that touches a chord for me too. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
no, I do too, and thank you for sharing that personal story, which was also very touching. And I think for me it was my father too abandoned my mother when I was a baby, and I think that's probably why it's so relevant to me and why I include it in my writing. So you can see the correlation there, that it's something personal, right? And oftentimes
Yeah,
as writers we put these personal things, these elements into our writing.
we absolutely do. And sometimes we don't even understand that we're doing it. It's only something you see when you go back and look at your work. Or I had another thing too, that I went through a divorce back before Deborah and I got together. And one of the things that I had, my ex-wife had a lot of issues. And I think now one of the reasons I was in the relationship was to sort of take care of her. I felt like I'm the person who can help her and fix her and will be understanding, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the only reason I'm telling you this is because, and this is another place you can find out about yourself. When I was in therapy at the end of that relationship, one of my, the therapist said to me, you know, you never talk about your missing biological father. And I said, well, why should I? I never knew him. He disappeared before I was born. I have a dad. My stepdad has been my dad since I was 2.5. I mean, I love him. He's been a great dad. And he said, well, I'm only asking because from what you said about your personal life and what I hear from you about your books, everything in your books is always about people trying to save people, especially father figures trying to save people. He said, do you think there could be something going on there? And I just kind of went, geez, God, I'd certainly point that out to somebody if I was a therapist, So sometimes we don't even see this stuff until somebody says, by the way, is that a factor in your life or in your work or something? So yeah, no, I mean, of course, I didn't have a biological father that I knew. So there's something in the back of my mind that says he deserted my family, even though it wasn't a family then, but that's what it meant. And I will never be that person. I will not do it. I mean, even if I stay in situations that are not good until I'm ready to kill myself, I'm so unhappy, but I'm not the person who deserts people. So yeah, you find these things out, and art and therapy, and sometimes they're both the same, are ways to do so.
No, I totally understand. Again, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's these unconscious or subconscious things that emerge in our writing. So yeah, just it's fascinating. I did want to get to a question from the wonderful booktuber Dr. Philip Chase. Friend of the channel again. Hey, Philip, always great to see him here. And author. Sorry, I forgot to mention author. And he's talking about Philip is also a self-published author and so far very successful. And his question for Tad was, given the increasing viability of self-publishing, would you consider indulging your desire to write something different and publish it on your own? He just adds there that there's a creative freedom in self-publishing.
Absolutely. And there are two factors that have mitigated that, Philip, for me. One of them is that because my wife, Deborah, who we first met, she was my British publisher, and she's the business head of our family and the business brain. Me spending more time in self-publishing would invariably drag her into it. And she would have to be very involved in the business end of that. And she already has a lot on her plate, poor thing. So that's something that has made me hesitant. I've actually suggested it a few times, and she's given me this look. And that was nothing more needed to be said. Like, oh, and
you know what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that look, right? But the other thing is, and this is probably even the bigger factor, is just simply time. Just simply time, because I've got the books that I'm already pledged to write and that I've been given advances on and things like that. I don't very often have the time to sit down with a book from scratch and put it together, because there's a lot of world building involved. I have, as I mentioned, several in my head that I want to write, which might be more appropriately done self-published in some shape or form. And we'll see if I can find the time to write them. I was just saying to Deborah the other night, actually, I'm going to have to write 2 books sometime in the next couple of years at the same time if I want to do some of these other projects. So that's been the other issue, is just, when you write these god awful long multi-volume things, you always feel like you're keeping an audience waiting, and you don't want to take time away when people are waiting, and work on something else instead. So on the occasions when I have, like sometimes writing a short story or having to do some other project for some reason, I kind of keep my mouth shut about it, because I don't want the people waiting for the next volume of the trilogy stroke tetralogy to be upset that I'm doing something else.
Wow. Well, I think that regardless, your readers would read anything from you, irrespective of what method it's published in. So,
I'll keep trying that. Fortunately, I'm in good health. I'm no longer young, but I'm in good health. I figure I've got another 10 to 20 years of writing ahead of me. I intend to do as much as possible, and get to some of the ideas that I've had to put aside, because they weren't maybe as commercial, or they weren't as easy to sell, or something like that. So some of that may have to be done with self-publishing, just because my publishers can only do so much. So I'm by no means saying I won't do it. I just haven't had a chance to so far very much.
Well, again, we're anxious to read. I still have so much of your works to catch up on. I'm in the middle of Last King of Boston Art, and I haven't. Which is kind of leading to my next question. That I started, I guess, backwards in reading that series. That's the first work that I've read from you, rather than starting
right.
with Memories, Sorrow, and Thorn.
Right.
So some people might say that's backwards, but one thing I absolutely loved about it is that you're reading these characters, and I'm 54, and I guess it's nostalgia, or maybe it's just you feel there's this commonality with characters that are older a bit. I'm not saying I'm wiser, but these characters wiser, more experienced. They've gone through so much together. It was just I thought it was just so neat to read those first, and knowing that I'm going to go back later on and read the original series. But what was it like to write a follow-up series now with these characters that, it's a bit of a time jump. They're older.
Yeah.
They've evolved. So and you've grown with these characters, like
Oh,
you've grown with these
absolutely.
characters.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what's it like to write this subsequent follow-up series now, going forward, where they're in their later years, and and I love the relationship, especially between the two main characters, the king and the queen, and just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what was it like to write that?
Actually, interestingly, and I've told this story before, but the whole project sprung out of that. But I'll answer your question after that. But in a nutshell, or at least as small of a container as I can make it, um, somewhere along the line, Deborah is much more of the business head than I am. I just tend to always kind of go like, I'll do the thing that seems interesting to me. But Deborah, being more sensible, has always said, well, people are always asking about this. Why don't you do another one of these, or what? And so we were having one of these conversations. We were probably also broke at the time. And she said, why don't you, people have been asking for another Ostenard book for years, decades. Why don't you've never done that? You wrote like one short story, I mean, that's all you've ever done, or one very short novel. And so I was trying to explain to her, like, I don't work that way. I can't just manufacture something. To me, that would be a franchise. That's starting out with the logo first and only deciding how you're going to run the business later. I can't work it that way. The story has to be there. I have to want to write. So anyway, so we're having, this couple conversation, which has all these other hidden meanings about like financial stability and all this in it. And also Deborah's very good judgment, because as I said, she was a publisher. I mean, she's not somebody who's just walking in, going, oh, I have all these ideas. She actually published books for years and very well. So that night, after we had this conversation, I'm like lying in bed and I'm thinking, if she just doesn't understand, I'd have to do this and I don't have an idea. And anyway, I mean, it's like 30 years have passed. I'm not the same person that wrote that original book, and 30 years. I got divorced. I moved to another country. I had kids. The kids have grown up, I mean, all these things have changed. And as I was thinking that, somehow the idea has kind of shifted. And it was like, what would have happened to the characters if that same amount of time had passed? And like 20 seconds later, it was beginning to go click, 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 and all these ideas, again, the agglomeration of free range ideas were suddenly happening. And I must have lay there for another 2 hours and got up the next morning and said, oh my God, you're right. I was wrong. I've got an idea. It's there. And now I have to write it because it's going to kill me if I don't, because it's just now it's going throb, throb, throb. So that was where the Ostenard sequel came from, was me trying to explain to her why I couldn't write a book because 30 years had passed. And instead it became the feature of the book, that we will just skip directly to these people who are now as old as I am. And normally we only get the happily ever after. So what does that really look like? Is it happy? Is it ever after? And that's what happened. Now, as far as writing it itself, and your earlier question, PL, the main thing was I was worried about getting the gist of the main characters right, because I am a very character-oriented writer, and it's one of the things I think that people, certainly that they express to me, is that they really like the characters and the humanity of them and the roundedness of them. So that was super important. But the interesting thing was, while I had really crap memory in terms of like minor characters and what had happened and who I'd killed and who was left-handed and what color eyes people's were, all that crap was long gone. I mean, I'd written 20 books since then, but the characters themselves, especially the main characters, Simon, Miriam L, Benebek, is Grimner, all these characters that were central to the first set of books, who were still around in the second set of books, I felt I felt like as if they had grown during that time too, but they were still fundamentally the same people. And I felt like I knew them. It was really weird. I am not one of those kind of romantic, oh, so-and-so, my character stands behind me and whispers in my, no, I'm not like that. I'm pretty rationalist about these things. But certainly I felt as though these characters are real to me, and I don't have to think much about what they would say or do or would have chosen to do in the times that I'm not showing, how they would have reacted to loss or happiness or whatever. That feels like I know it already, even though I haven't touched these characters for 30 years. So in that sense, it was a revelation. In the sense that I couldn't remember a whole lot of important stuff, I was super lucky to have a group of readers who knew the books better than I did, that had read the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books the way that I read Tolkien, and so all I had to do was go, did I kill so-and-so off in the earlier books? And they go, yeah, you totally killed him, Tad. You can't use him again. I go, damn, okay, I'll think of somebody else. Any suggestions? They go like, you could try so-and-so. He was kind of boring, but you didn't kill him. I go, oh, cool, okay. So that was kind of amusing to me because I've always been a detailed guy, but to realize there are people out there who know my work much better than I do because I hadn't read the damn things for 30 plus years. Whereas they had, like I did with Tolkien, had been like reading it every year for years. So it was both a wonderful experience in getting to know these characters again, but also a horrifying experience in realizing how little I remembered of my own life and all these things that I'd written that other people had these strong reactions to. And I'm like, really? Did that happen? Okay, I'll take your word for it. I can't remember.
What a great feeling though that you have readers that are so involved at an intricate level with your writing that you can say that they know your characters better than you do as the author. So I think that's a special feeling though, right?
Well, it's certainly, yeah. I mean, I don't know if they know the characters better than I do, but they certainly know the details better than I do. And in some things, they definitely know the characters themselves better than I do. No, it's a wonderful feeling because, I mean, well, you write. Taylor, do you write also?
No, I'm not brave enough.
Not yet.
Okay, I'll just
PL's working on me.
Okay, I'll just address this to PL then. But I can't speak for you, but I know that for me, one of the biggest things about being a writer and being published and all that stuff was the moment that I realized that some readers were having the same kind of experience with my work that I had with the writers I really, really liked.
Yes.
And that was an amazing moment, just to see somebody say, oh, I couldn't put it down. I stayed up all night because I had to find out what happened to so-and-so. And that more than anything else that's happened to me, including making a living off of the field, but more than anything else, that is the thing that made me most grateful to have pursued this career, because those connections with books and writers that I loved when I was young were so important to me. And by young, I mean right up into my 20s, were so crucial to me. And, when you love a book, you feel like, I really want to sit down with this person who wrote it. I'd love to just hear them talk and ask them questions, and we'd like get a beer, a cup of coffee or whatever, and just be buddies because I feel like I know them. And I had that feeling about so many writers, and to hear other people having that kind of feeling about my work was a real sense of, okay, I've done something. I have become the next generation for another group of readers. And that's just cool. That's just great.
Yeah, I definitely concur. Of course, on a very microscopic level compared to you and your readership and your success.
Maybe for now, but you'll find it out more as you go.
Bring your lips to God's ears, sir. But yeah, I just want to get to, because we had just kind of backtracking. We've been talking about Last King of Boston Art. There was a question from one of the from Jack about that, and I just want to get that in. That he asked, were the Travels in the Joshua's family and the Prophecy twins in particular in the Last King of Boston Art trilogy inspired by? Oh, we're back to Tolkien here. The Children of Urin.
Yeah. Probably not, because although I had read the Silmarillion, I read this, when I was 14 or whatever, 15, the Silmarillion came out. And of course, I immediately read it several times. But I don't believe, for one thing, they're a little more downplayed in the Silmarillion than later on when Christopher Tolkien excerpted it and turned it into a whole book. But no, actually, the funny thing about the Joshua and Vorsheva's twins and the prophecy is that a lot of people assumed when I wrote that I was setting up a sequel. And that was one of the most common things. People said, "Oh, I know what you did there. I see what you did. You're going to have these twins, and that's the next set of books." Well, you can see if that's what I planned. It took me 30 years to get around to it. And in fact, no, it was rather the opposite. My publishers had to remind me. Betsy Walheim, my editor and publisher, was like, "We're finally going to find out about the twins." And I went, "Oh yeah." Oh, right. Okay, good. Yeah, we'll make that part of the story too. It really hadn't occurred to me at the time. And this goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. At the time, when I was writing those books, I mentioned the thing about the Thomas Covenant books and this idea that just like nothing happened until the story. And then all of a sudden, everything goes hog wild and then it's over again and things go back to being placid. And I only put that bit about this kind of significant magical prophecy to these significant characters in there to kind of suggest to the readers, this is how things are in this invented world, that things happen. People get prophecies, people have magical things. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, but it's definitely part of this world. So that was my only intention with it. But so I certainly wasn't thinking particularly of the children of Hurin because that was a very significant bit for Tolkien. Whereas, to be honest, this was more of an atmospheric than an actual plot line for me. It was just meant to show this is the kind of world where even though we won't see these children's destiny, but they have a destiny because they are significant children and a significant fairy person has said this prophecy over them. So yeah, probably not specifically influenced, although when you read as much stuff as I do, as probably all three of us do here, that it's really hard to say what influences you and what doesn't. I every now and then I will suddenly see something. I will pick up an old Michael Moorcock book or something that I probably read when I was 13, and I'll see a character name or a something and go, "Oh my God, I totally stole that from Moorcock," and didn't even realize it because I read it when I was, in junior high school. So it's hard to say exactly what the influences are, but I didn't have a conscious influence from the Children of Hurin.
Speaking of influences, not just for writing, but for what we choose to read, if you'll allow me to go with something quite surface level here, we all judge books by their covers, right? So your new series has had a cover change halfway through. And also you recently had the Grim Oak Press version of the Dragonbone chair that came out. And that thing is... Wow, that's beautiful. I'm trying not to use curse words, but that is a gorgeous book. So I'm wondering from your perspective, if you've noticed a change in maybe the rekindling of interest in the Dragonbone chair from this new edition, or if the cover change halfway through your current series, if that had any effect on how people are consuming your books.
It's really hard to say. For one thing, part of what's going on is that during the process of these books, my career-long American publishers actually left their business arrangement with the larger publishing company because they are a private company. And so they always did all their own editorial and covers and things like that. But they used the sales force and the business structure of a bigger publishing company, which for most recently was Penguin and then Random House Penguin. And then when they merged, why they didn't call it Random Penguin, none of us can figure out because it's so much a better name than Penguin Random House. Random Penguin. I mean, come on. Anyway, it's a no-brainer. So during the course of all of this stuff happening, my publishers left. I won't go into all the details of it, but they left and they basically hooked up. That sounds very Friday Night at the Singles Bar. They basically connected and moved to another publishing empire. And so that stuff has been all very in transition anyway and very complicated. But one of the things that I don't think it was a reason for them leaving the other company, but it was evidentiary of one of the reasons they left the other company was that at a certain point they just went, Michael Moorcock's too, not Michael Moorcock, Michael Whalen is too expensive. We are not gonna authorize you guys to have the most expensive fantasy artist there is. And just basically stepped in and slammed the door and said, you have to, that's not going to be part of your budget now. So yeah, I see the question, Eddie. That's it. That was a corporate decision. I don't think it had anything to do with my publishers moving, but it was certainly indicative of a growing difference of opinion. That said, I was very involved. I've always been involved with my covers in one way or another. And I was involved with the new versions as well, just in the sense of kind of semi designing them a little bit, or at least telling them what I wanted. If we were going to go, I wanted to go completely different, and not even pretend that it was the same thing, But now, last part of the answer, do we know what effect this has had? No. And the reason is because this stuff, first of all, getting information like that out of publishers, even with the best intentions on their part, takes a while anyway. It's also confused by a number of other things where various markets bleed together and stuff like that. So, for instance, I sell a lot of English language books in Europe. And so waiting for all the information to trickle back in takes a long time. So I don't really know if it's had any effect. It can't have helped because, Michael Whalen is a brilliant artist and he's done brilliant work that I've been lucky enough to have on many of my covers. I didn't have any control over it. And in a sense, not even my publishers didn't have a control. It was something at a corporate level above them. And that's one of the things that I told some other young writers is that, the benchmarks change over the years. So when you're first out there in the world, all you want to do is have somebody read your manuscript. It's like whether it's an agent or an editor, you just want feedback. You want somebody to know that you are alive and you wrote something. Then you just want to sell something, and that's great. You just want to sell. I sold a book, and then you want that book to get published and edited well and and have a nice cover and all. Anyway, the benchmarks keep moving, but you hit a certain point, and I couldn't tell you specifically when, but after you've had a few books out and had a little bit of success, where the stuff that's going on is political. Those are the benchmarks. The benchmarks are, how much money are they going to put into the ad buy, and are they going to send me on tour? Are we getting sales in certain foreign markets that usually like fantasy or science fiction or whatever? There's all these different things. So for the last 20 years or so, it's all been stuff like this, where everything is about, do my publishers love me? Do they want to make me happy? If they're not making me happy, is it their fault or is there something else going on? It's all this political stuff. And again, I'm so grateful to have a wife with a business head and a lot of experience, so that, not that I don't participate in these things, but it means that she does the hard parts of saying, this is a good offer, this is not a good offer, we should definitely grab a hold of this. Oh, did you see this? Somebody wants to interview you and they sound like they'd be a really good choice, or all that kind of stuff. So she has been running point for me for years, and I absolutely commend myself for my brilliance in marrying her. And we're dealing with, the ups and downs of a career, which I've now been doing for so long, I can actually see it, which is kind of scary, because the first 10 or so years you're doing anything, it's like, well, I might be doing something else, up the line. I might change, or, I might become so famous that I'm catapulted into the world of film or something. But I've been doing this long enough. I see the shape of it, and it's about politics now. And right at the moment, the politics was no more Michael Whalen. So we deal with it as best we can, and we lament, because Michael does great things.
Yes, he certainly does. And again, kudos to I think a lot of us would argue that you are already quite successful, and I would think that the whole movie stuff is eminent. Funny coincidence again that just a little funny anecdote that my lovely wife Deborah is also my business manager, and she's the one that kind of keeps me on track and puts me back in line and does a lot of things behind the scenes to make the whole PL store thing work.
She's not the same Deborah, is she? I'm not being double dipped here by my business manager, Emma.
Plot twist eminent.
Congratulations, PL. I'm glad you found your Deborah too. And I mean, yeah, it's super important, especially when you work in the arts or in anything, communications, is you need people to believe in you. It's super important, because invariably we will all have those dark nights of the soul where we say, why am I even doing this? Does anybody even care? And you need people around you, whether if you get lucky and you start to get published, then you get some of that from writers, or if you whatever field you're in. But before that point, you better damn well have friends or family or spouses who will say to you, you keep going. I believe in you. That's super important.
Yep, I'm sure it goes the same for book 2 with Taylor. That I don't want to speak for Taylor, but I'm sure she can tell you she has lots of family and friends that are imminently supportive, and that's you, Jay Taylor, in that.
Yes. BookTube is a very slow crawl as a build for most people. Some people, shoot off right away, and good for them. But for the majority of us, myself included, it's a very slow crawl, and it takes a lot of, I'm sure, just like writing, passion. It's a passion project until it isn't, and it's a long time till it isn't. So,
and even if it's a passion project, there's still points where it's work. It is work, and sometimes it's really hard work because of the fact that it's art, and when you're doing your best, and when you're just mailing it in. And unfortunately, it's not like working at the post office or something, sorting letters, if they even do that anymore, where you literally, it's being mailed in, it's like, no, when you're not doing your best stuff. And you need to have to believe in what you're doing. So anything that will help you to have that confidence in terms of people around you, or, whatever, or little plush toys that still love you, even though you're grown up.
Hug them at night, at least you love me, right?
Yeah.
What pets, whatever it takes.
Tell me I'm good, ladybug. Yeah.
Well, as I said, Tab, we would, most of us would argue that you have achieved, very, in some cases, some people might say, lofty level of success. But on that vein, there's a great question there from Zero Set Cool. So, what are some fantasy series, books, or authors that you believe are criminally underrated and need more attention, especially novice writers?
Unfortunately, I am not the best person to ask about these things, because what I realized is that I have largely stopped reading fiction, not because I don't still love fiction, but simply because the time I have to spend so much more time now reading nonfiction, especially when I'm doing numerous projects at the same time. So most of the things that I would go, well, have you read this? Have you read that? Are things that were influential to me. I do know there are some things, though. For instance, the Hilary Mantel books on Thomas Cromwell, which is not fantasy, it's historical fiction. But those are brilliant because of the attempt to not just retell historical fact, but to create an understanding of a medieval mindset, or early Renaissance mindset in the main character, because you're in his head quite a bit. And those are just beautifully written. So anybody because if you're writing fantasy, you are by nature usually writing non-current characters. I think that's a wonderful example. And I can't think of the most recent one is The Mirror and the Light and Bring Up the Bodies. And I guess Wolf Hall. Wolf Hall is the first. Anyway, those are strongly recommended. Also, and again, these are Wolf Hall, and those books are fairly recent, but the Lyman Chronicles by Dorothy Dunnett are not super well known, but they're wonderfully written historical fiction. God damn, that woman upsets me because she knew so much. She's making these just incredibly complex references that clearly, she must have read a huge amount of not just medieval history, but medieval and Renaissance literature, because it takes place in the late 16th or early 17th century in Scotland. But the main character is very witty and very clever and has read everything, all the classical poets and all that stuff. And damned if she doesn't just knock you on the head with it, but in a truly wonderful way. And the plotting is brilliant, and the main character is always fascinating. So even though that's also historical fiction, you start with a character like that, you can put them in any world you want to, and it will work. As far as more commonly known fantasy or science fiction, definitely the Earthsea books, the Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books, because not only is she trying to build a system of magic which felt realistic, but a world in which it felt like that magic would be used. So she's both world building and system building. And she also just had a really good idea of who people are that not everybody notices. James Tiptree was another writer, coincidentally both female writers, although Tiptree used a male pseudonym. Actually, James Tiptree wrote a wonderful story called The Women Men Don't Notice. But Le Guin also does that, and not just with women. I mean, she just is really good at saying, these are people in the world, and this is what's going on in them, and you would have never guessed, because we tend to push away anybody we don't immediately notice and think about. I'm still very fond of oh God, I've gone blank on the name, Lloyd Alexander books. I think there's a lot, even though they're kind of all ages books, I think there's a lot to be grasped in the Lloyd Alexander books in terms of writing epics and drawing a reader along. So I guess Terran Wanderer maybe is the first of those. I can't remember.
Chronicles are pretty in that.
Yeah.
Black
exactly.
Cauldron, yeah.
Black Cauldron.
Love those books.
Excellent books. Definitely aimed at a slightly younger readership, but they just give you a real good idea of how to make a character sympathetic and then take the character somewhere and you follow them along. So that one, for some reason, just pops into my mind. I'd have to think about it, because I said I don't read that much modern fantasy and science fiction, not because there's anything wrong with it. In fact, there's a lot of really wonderful stuff happening when I do dip my toes back in, but just because I'm primarily reading nonfiction these days. And when I do want to read something else, I oftentimes will read crime fiction or something else instead, just for a break, just because reading fantasy sometimes feels a bit like, as the British say, a busman's holiday. It's not really a vacation.
Yeah, no, understood. I know we're getting near the end here. I just wanted to get to a couple of comments here in the chat. But that's okay. E.D. Bell, the wonderful E.D. Bell, who's a great indie author herself. She's a broke indie publisher who scrapes and sacrifices to do the right artistic thing for authors that cannot say anything nice about the decision to cut Whelan so late in the series. Yes.
Neither can I, and neither can my actual publishers, the ones I've been with since 1985. That's why I wanted to, if I was going to talk about it at all, that's why I wanted to distinguish the idea that it came from higher up the corporate ladder. And corporate ladders are notoriously for being the roosting places of people who don't know anything about the field that they're actually. I mean, there's a famous story back in the 80s when I got into the industry. There were a lot of corporations were buying into publishing with the idea that they were going to create these vertical supply chains. So if you had, Gulf and Wesson, Gulf and Western. Anyway, if they owned like a movie theater or a TV studio, then they also wanted to own like book publishing companies, with the idea that they would have this advantage of finding material. What they didn't understand is that all these businesses are different and you can't just walk in. So there's famous quotes of people like in these corporations who just bought these publishing companies going, why aren't you only publishing the bestsellers? And people having to point out to them, well, first of all, you don't always know what the bestsellers are. Second of all, there are writers like, say, Elmore Leonard, who publish 40 goddamn books before they become world famous, and then you know, Elmore Leonard actually is a great example because he was like 20 years or more in the
Yeah.
wilderness.
Yeah.
And then by the end of his career, he was an instant movie factory. You know, his new book would come out and somebody would buy the rights, and half the time they got made into movies, which is a super high rate. But if people had applied that kind of logic, you know, he never would have got to that point. And a lot of writers today aren't getting to that point because the corporate math. And that's why I hope that self-publishing is a godsend for a lot of writers and that they can find their way, because corporate publishing has always been, well, not always, but since the 80s, it's been a bit stupid. You know, publishing used to be a kind of a profession that you went into with no idea except that you loved books, because nobody got rich in publishing. That was just a given. The margins are paper thin. You know, it doesn't make a huge amount of money compared to music or TV or something like that. And then the corporations got involved and they were just like, well, why are we publishing all this stuff that doesn't sell very well? Because that's called the mid list. And that's where a lot of the bestsellers will come from if you have patience and nurture them and have real editors and publishers working with them to turn them into great writers. You know, they're not Shirley Temple. They're not going to be stars when they're 6 years old, all of them. You know, some of them have to develop over time. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a pet bugbear of mine because Deborah had to go through a lot of that, even though she had some pretty good situations, but she still ran into a lot of stupidity. So
Yeah, that is unfortunate. Just you were mentioning Elmore Leonard, and we talked about movies adaptations. So Jack asked if there's any word on an Austen Ard adaptation that you can speak on. Perhaps you can't contractually, but
well, I can say that at the moment there's nothing significant going on with Austen Ard. We have a few other things that there's some distinct possibilities on that I won't talk about. Not because I'm worried about the legality, but just because my experience is that as soon as I talk about something, that it automatically just sinks, bubbling into the depths, and everybody on board is killed, and it never gets salvaged. So I'm just going to keep my mouth shut about it and see if it happens. I've had that happen to me. You know the Beatles song "Tax Man," right? There's the lyric in it, which had to do with the British taxation system in the mid '60s. There's one for you, 19 for me.
Yeah.
Well, sorry about that. Well, Deborah and I have a very strong belief that with these kinds of things, when you get somebody coming to you going, "We're really interested in making something out of something that you own the rights to," 1 out of 20 of those turns into anything. But the problem is, you never know which 1 out of the 20. So just like what we were saying about publishing, you have to nurture them all until they explode into flames and kill everybody around them, or, you know, and we've had those kinds of things happen. I mean, I don't know if anybody listening to this will know this, but I mean, we had a whole thing where we had some people who were trying to turn Tail Chaser's song into an animated film, which seemed pretty obvious. And they were going around for years trying to get support, and they finally got a financial thing in place. And it turned out that it was with the Saudi Arabian Prince's Arts Fund. And like right as we were about to sign the papers, the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was beaten to death by the prince's hired thugs. And of course, at that point, I mean, you know, half the people I was working with were Jewish and had been a little bit like, Saudi Arabian money? I'm not too sure about that anyway, because of all some of the other things they support. But as soon as that happened, we just all went, well, that's the end of that. You know, there's no possible way we're going to take money from Saudi Arabia in this particular, I mean, until something's done about this, which, by the way, it never has been done. Nothing has ever happened and nobody's been punished except in the most ridiculous ways. Anyway, but so that's the example of something that was like 5 or 6 years leading up to that, of negotiations, meetings, me rewriting scripts or editing scripts, blah, 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 blah. And then, and in a matter of 1 weekend, the whole thing went gone. So yeah, I'm a little superstitious, but if it happens, it happens, you know, and I'll be perfectly happy. I won't be shocked or surprised if it's not exactly like my work, because that's what an adaptation is. Naturally, I would hope that it would be done by somebody who cares enough about the work in the first place. And the people that we've been talking to about things are in that category. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. But beyond that, no news. And at the moment, nothing on Ostenard. Everybody said to me, oh, Game of Thrones is so big. And George is always talking about how big an influence you were and stuff like that. Man, those offers are going to come rolling in. Literally nothing. Crickets, tumbleweeds rolling past, not a word. So that could just be because, like they told me once with another project of mine, we don't need a fantasy television show. We have Xena, Warrior Princess. Why would anybody need another fantasy show? Nothing against Xena, mind, except that what I was proposing was nothing similar at all. But
Well, that's
you're
crazy.
dealing with people in a different market. They don't see things the way that insiders do. They're like, well, that's one fantasy show. How many more can they want? So.
Well,
Well, I'm sorry to hear that the project fell through, but I just, the more that I hear about the process of creating adaptations, especially from like fantasy works that have a big fan base already built in, like if even Sanderson is saying things are unsure and I'm not, getting direct deals, it's like, that process has to be lots of smoke and mirrors. Because
absolutely. Yeah. Now, I mean, to be honest, and I have some little experience in this, it's a miracle movies ever get made, to be honest with you, let alone, movies with anything difficult about them. But just the process of making them requires so many things to come through. There's just dozens and dozens of them that blow up way before they ever get to the first test flight off the launching pad. They just don't ever make it. So it's another thing I learned after having done a little bit of the Hollywood shuffle for a while is just all you can do is just say, if it happens, it happens. And I'll do what I can when the situation arises. But if I sat back and counted on it or got excited every time somebody sent us a query, I'd go nuts. So, I've got a job. It's a very good job. My family relies on it so that they don't die. And because of that fact, I have something that will keep me focused on it. And if anything else happens with Hollywood or anything else, I will certainly tell people. But it's not something I can sit around and hope will happen because, it's just too weird a field.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to give Taylor an opportunity to ask some final questions before she does, I just want to point out Jack's comment, which I believe that's a common consensus. Frankly, Tad himself is very underrated compared to the likes of GRM and Robert Jordan.
Well, I appreciate that. I liked Robert Jordan as a person. I knew him a little bit. His books were not huge favorites of mine, not particularly because there was anything wrong with them. They were just a type of book that at the time there was so much coming out that I didn't want to read any more epic fantasy. George is a different character in that I already knew George. George was a very good writer whose work I already knew from short stories and from other novels and things like that. So when he went into writing an epic fantasy and credited me in part for showing, I'm paraphrasing him, but saying basically, well, I really like Tad Williams's work. And so, if he can work that mode and make it happen. So I was very interested to see what George would do. And indeed, he made something very special and very personal out of it. And that was great. So did Jordan. It just was more of the kind that I don't read as much of, but not a criticism. It was also when I started reading less fantasy and realizing that if I'm going to write this stuff, I don't necessarily want to read other people's anything that's close to mine, because that's going to start seeping into my work. And I'd rather have things that are more unusual seeping into my work. I'd rather read Thomas Pynchon or Kurt Vonnegut or, Jane Austen, big favorite of mine, and I'd rather try and bring some of that into my work than the work of other fantasy writers. So.
Pride and Prejudice is fantastic. So just have to make that comment, but
no, it's a masterpiece, and it has lessons for any writer of any kind of fiction. It just absolutely does. The dialogue is brilliant. The show don't tell of it all. You totally understand what's being said, even though none of the words match what's being said. It's parlor. It's the way people had to talk in those days, and even if people hated each other, they could never say it. So they would find these very, it's the same way I was saying about Dickens. I love that hot house thing of you can't say what you want to say, but you still want people to know how you feel. So yeah, I love
Yes.
Jane
And it
Austen.
lends to so much comedy when handled correctly. It's just beautiful.
Absolutely.
So I know we don't want to take up too much of your time, and thank you so much for already offering as much time as you have. But if you'll humor, my last question is not quite book based, and feel free to tell me if my information is incorrect. But I heard tell on the interweb somewhere that before you were an author, you had a taco stand. Is this correct? And
I,
I that intrigued me so much because my husband is a chef, and we opened a little fried chicken stand for a while as well,
oh,
as kind of like
excellent.
a side thing we were doing. And I have such a soft spot for food and street food specifically. And
Yeah.
I just is that true information? What's up
It's
with that?
it's partially true. It was one of the first jobs I had after moving out of my parents' house, and I was working in a taco place. It was not mine. I did not open it. It was
Okay.
called
Okay.
Taco Tio, which translates to Uncle Taco. And it was, like on the side of the El Camino, which was the main drag from San Francisco all the way down to San Jose. And we got in all kinds of trouble there. But it was an interesting place to work. And I used to drive back up every night into the hills, which is where I was living there, and felt very grown up doing it. I am a very foodie person, but my history of work experience and entrepreneurial experiences is extremely weird and checkered. I've done so many different kinds of things. My friends and I opened a discotheque. I have been somebody who drew illustrations for army manuals. I sold shoes. I managed art stores. Just done a ton of different things. Worked in different restaurants. It's one of the reasons I'm an inveterate over tipper is, having worked in a restaurant and knowing what that's like, dealing with people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I am not going to be the one to punish these people for being stuck with my table. Even if the kitchen's slow tonight, I can understand how these things work. So, yeah. And I'm a foodie person. I have thought several times about opening a restaurant, and I congratulate you on having done so. As I said, my friends and I opened a club, and they're both crazy things to do, just utterly
Yes.
crazy. And I'm sure that that's one of the takeaways you came away, at least the first part after you finished
Mm-hmm.
doing it. It's like, what was I thinking? I will never do that again. And then a few years up the road, it's like pregnancy. You start to look at it and go like, maybe it wasn't
Yep.
that bad.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
But yeah,
Tattoos,
go ahead.
pregnancy, restaurants, they're all the same.
Exactly. So yes, I worked in one, have many funny stories from those days, but it was not my restaurant, and it just as well, because I was probably not the ideal employee, nor was anybody else that I was working with. We were 18 years old and just out of high school, and I wouldn't have hired me. I still wouldn't hire me. So
Well, I think having such a varied background must bring so much to your writing. Having been in all of these different spaces and with so many different kinds of people, that can only add breadth and depth to what you write. So,
I think so. Yeah, and because I didn't, as like everybody else in my family and everybody else among my friends, they all went immediately to college after they got out of high school, and I was in a kind of a different space. I just wanted to be on my own and supporting myself, not because I was like in a hurry to get away from my family. My parents were lovely people, but I just wanted that experience. Nobody can tell me anything. All my mistakes are my own. And so I put off going to college for a few years. And then when I eventually did go to Berkeley, I dropped out. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I met a lot of people I might not have met otherwise, and began to see other parts of the world than I would have if I'd gone straight from Palo Alto, which is where I live again now. Um, which is very suburban college town. Now it's a big money center, but when I was growing up, it was very much a college town, and had gone straight off to college and then gone into some kind of a career right after that. Whereas, I kind of bummed around for years doing different jobs and stuff, and got a large cross section of people. And I think that's always useful for any writer or artist to have as an experience, to know lots of different kinds of people, and to get over the idea that you are something special yourself, that you're putting your focus on somebody is doing them a favor. that they're somehow less important than you are. That's a really important lesson for a writer to learn. You are not more important than the character or the subject of your painting or whatever it is. And if you're doing that, then you're not really focusing on the thing that you're creating. You're focusing on yourself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Absolutely does. Yeah, both of us. You were just like, yep, words to live by.
Yeah.
And I see Drew's comment, and thank you, Drew. Very, very kind. I hope you enjoy the rest of the books. There's a lot of books now. I've written a couple of dozen or more, and some of them are quite long. So if you're just starting to read my work, thank you. It's appreciated. Don't worry, it won't run out right away. And I'll continue to write. So.
And we're so excited about that. I personally, I absolutely love the Witchwood Crown and Empire Grass. Have Into the Dark on my, I was on my shelves, and now it's packed in these boxes.
Yeah.
One of the things I read later on, and looking forward to that, and of course the Navigator's Children to finish off the series. I believe that's the last book in the series.
Yes, that is definitely the last book in the series. It was supposed to be 3. I keep doing this. Anyway, sorry. A moment of the dam bursting and the regrets flooding out. I keep thinking I can do it in 3, and then I keep getting into the middle of the second book and going, no way I'm going to finish this in one more book. So anyway, yeah, but it's definitely 4 because I've done it. I'm just doing the editing right now. So it will not lurch over into another volume. I promise.
Well, that's all great. I don't think any of us are going to complain about having more Tad Williams books.
Well, that's kind of you, but I still like to finish stories. I think that's an important part of a writer's job, is to actually finish something and then start something new. So.
No, you're right. But we just want to say, Tad, as we're closing off here, thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been absolutely wonderful, so generous with your time, and so amazing with the answer to all the questions and the commentary. And I want to also say thank you so much to everyone in the chat for your questions, your commentary. I apologize, didn't get to all of them. But as we're wrapping up here, I just want to give you, Tad, and Taylor a chance to tell the audience. I mean, for Tad, for you, for the rare person who hasn't heard about your books or your work, where can they find out more about your books? What's your preferred social media?
Sure.
Places, things like that. And same for Taylor, my wonderful co-host. As we
okay. Well, do you want to do yours first, Taylor, or do you want to? Doesn't matter to me.
No, by all means, okay. You go first.
Well, at the moment, I'm on Twitter, although there's more activity on my wife's Twitter. For some reason, she called it Mrs. Tad. That was not my choice. I was like, oh my God, they're going to think I stood over you with a gun or something and made you name it after me. But as I said, she's the business head. See, she's going, no, because I'm going to put a lot of stuff about you in there. I'm like, okay. Anyway, so either Deb's Mrs. Tad, all one word, or mine, which is just Tad Williams, I think. Or one of my 2 Facebook pages. And I was going to mention, if there's anybody here who had a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, please feel free to go on social media. I think I keep all my social media open to the public so that anybody can post something. So if you have a question or something, please go ahead and post it for me, and I will be happy to try and answer it. And yeah, that's basically it. And I'm waiting for Twitter to collapse, and then I'll, figure out what's next as far as that goes. Because I know a lot of my friends are like, I'm this close to leaving Twitter. So, we'll see what happens. I'll go where my wife goes, because Twitter is her baby. And she lives on it. So anyway, and now it's your turn, Taylor.
Thank you. So you can find me on my booktube channel, May Between the Pages, which you can see below. I have taken a break recently because I just gave birth to a child in the last month.
Congratulations. So, how wonderful.
Thank you. So
weight, size, have you picked out a gender yet?
Yes, from the book of genders you can choose from. Yes, so I have been very busy, taking care of her right now, but I do plan to come back soon. So for those of you, who are waiting and are still with me, thank you for being patient. You can also find my book reviews on Before We Go blog, which is a review site both PL and I are on, run by Beth Tabler. You can also see all my reviews of anything that I read on Goodreads. I am also doing completely not planned in tandem with this interview, but I was doing a pre-me fantasy TBR.
Right.
And Tad, you were very much on the top of that. So after this interview, consider that bumped up even higher. So you can look forward to thoughts on that soon on my channel.
Is that because you've been watching me and you're going, this guy is not going to last much longer? Is that part of it? He's clearly just clinging by his fingernails.
No, it's just everything you talk about is up my alley. The themes you talk about, everything. Oh, I can't wait now. So, and then if you want to go to my Twitter or any other social media, they're all in the descriptions of my videos on my channel. So that's probably the best place to find them.
Excellent. And congratulations again on having a child. I'm sure that's very hard work. I haven't had to do it myself, but I have had to be present for it a few times. So
yeah, it's its own reward, as many people say.
Yeah, it's reward. It's definitely a reward. There's certainly things about it that are so wonderful you could never get from anywhere else. But it's work. It is work. Yeah, and you still have. Is this your first?
It is, okay, yes.
So and I still have a few years ahead of you then before you're going to get rid of the diaper bags and start to move toward normality. So have a wonderful time. Enjoy it all. It zips by.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I've already learned the importance of concealer. So, you know, there's a lot of dark circles hidden under here.
I hear you. And PL, say hello to your Deborah for me.
I will absolutely, and you to yours. You know, special shout out to the Debras. They're the glue that keep us together. So thank you, sweetheart. Love you very much, Deb. If you're watching, I'm PL Stewart. Most of the time, you can find me with Taylor on Taylor's channel doing page chewing. If my channel, you know, mine is John King Saga 74/7. All links for Taylor and Tad's social media, etc., are also in the thumbnail if you'd like to find there. You can also follow me on Before We Go blog. Like Taylor, I'm an assistant editor there, and I post my reviews on Goodreads, etc. My Goodreads reviews of the first two books in Last King of Ostenard, which I thoroughly enjoyed, are also there and on Before We Go blog. And for my books, the John Kingdom Saga, 3 books out now, 4th working furiously on Alliance Pride, hopefully coming out in 2024 spring.
Don't be in such a hurry here. Say the name again, please, more clearly so I can hear it properly. What are the names of your books that are out so far?
So 3 books so far in the John Kingdom Saga. The first one is entitled A John Kingdom. The second one is in
QVC like holding. Here we go.
Brilliant. Nicely done. Okay.
The second is called The Last of the Atalanteans. That's book 2 in the John Kingdom Saga. And the third book currently out is entitled Lord and King. And that is the third book in a proposed 7-book series. And I am currently working on Alliance Pride, book 4, which is anticipated to be out in the spring of 2024. Excellent. So www.plstore.com is where you can find out more about the books. So
congratulations. That is having a book, having a child, both very important things, and neither one of them is easy. So
yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Listen, Tad, once again, you know, this is one of the highlights of my month for sure to have you on the show. Taylor and I are so grateful, so thankful for you to coming. Special shout out again to your Deborah. She was so wonderful in communication and setting things up. So thanks again, Deborah. Thank you again, everyone in the chat who tuned in to listen, and everyone who will watch afterwards who missed the live. Once again, this is Page Chewing, and you know, it's so great to have Tad Williams on the show. Taylor and I are just over the moon to be able to do this. And Tad will have, and Tad will have to have you back on the future to learn, especially more about things like you being a debt collector.
I got stories. I got stories. I can tell stories for days. So yes, peace. Lovely to talk to both of you. Much success to you. And I'd be happy to come back anytime. So.
That's fantastic. Don't say yes, because we'll have you back.
Sure. I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it. So.
All right, everyone, we're signing off here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.